Right. I have much pleasure being asked to introduce Professor Fazal Rizvi. Fazal Rizvi is a Professor of Global Studies in Education at the University of Melbourne, Australia, Emeritus Professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Social Sciences, a former editor of Discourse, and a past president of this association. But of course, such a bio note tells you very little about Fazal, and not the real Fazal, I would argue. Now, we know that Fazal has an outstanding list of highly cited publications. His research projects have charted the transformation of the field of higher education, in particular, over 30 years. Or was it 40, Fazal? I can't remember. I can attest that his reach and influence is significant, as wherever I go, he's always there before me. He's truly the transnational mobile academic. He's much sought after for his keynotes internationally, has an excellent reputation in the diverse fields of higher ed, globalisation, comparative and international education, elite schooling, and Australia-Asia relations. Fazal has been critical to the development of many fields of research, always with a focus on social justice and inclusion. He was one of the earliest writers on multiculturalism and racism in Australia when he was at Deakin. And there he undertook a policy analysis, for example, with Stephen Kemmers on major national programs such as the Participation and Equity Program, Dilemmas of Reform. It's something you should all read to understand where we've been and where we are now relative to issues around participation and equity and education policy. Then at the University of Queensland, he worked with Bob Lingard, Miriam Henry and Sandra Taylor on the OECD and education policy. This is one of the first landmark studies, much quoted, which is then one of the first of now the various books that they have brought out on policy sociology and globalisation. He established one of the first programs on internationalisation at Monash University. He was the Pro-Vice Chancellor of International Education for RMIT. And while at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, he initiated innovative teaching programs on globalisation. Now at the University of Melbourne, as I said, he's been around a bit, he continues to mentor multiple ECRs and postgraduate students. Now, Fazal has always been a good academic citizen and as a member of the AARE executive for many years, and he was influential while president by turning this organisation and our educational community towards Asia, when he convened the first joint conference between AARE and Singapore Association of Research and Education in 1996, and that was a landmark event in terms of us thinking about Asia, I think, in this community. He also, Fazal's analytical capacity, having trained in philosophy, and insight that he brings to research and educational debate is recognised because he always provides a stimulating analysis, provoking us to think differently. We all wait for Fazal's 3 points on any matter. A philosopher's right, it seems, to have something to say about anything at any time. But what is most important about Fazal is his generosity in terms of time and support, his warmth, his openness to others, his willingness to give advice, even if he's just met you. He is much appreciated by all his students and colleagues, and of course, his friends who love him dearly. So with much pleasure, I introduce you Professor Fazal Rizvi.
There goes my water. No, it's okay. It's all right. Yeah. Thank you very much. Hang on. I'm supposed to turn on this little contraption. Yeah, there we go. Is that okay? Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much, Jill, and really, really for that very kind introduction. I want to honor the people of Tirabul and Yoga people, and I'm really, really honored to be in a space that they have lived in for generations. And indeed, it is important for us to do this because the links to land are incredibly important, and the ways in which we think about this not only in terms of geography, but also morality, is absolutely fundamental to our understanding of who we are and where we are and how we might become. So that's something that I really cherish a great deal. This is the third time that I've had the privilege of giving a major address at AARE. The first was a presidential address in 1996 in Singapore, as Jill just mentioned, when I spoke about the changing politics of Asia-Australia relations and its implications for educational policy and practice. My address followed exactly 3 weeks after Pauline Hanson's maiden speech in the Australian Parliament about being swamped with Asians. And I don't think she uses that language all that extensively any longer. The second keynote I presented was the Redford address in Adelaide, a conference organized by my friend Mari Brennan. That address had a much more optimistic and normative tone, as I explored the pedagogic possibilities of cosmopolitanism and argued that the idea of cosmopolitanism was best conceptualized as a mode of intercultural learning rather than an abstract moral principle. Today, my address is not so optimistic, as I try to understand a more socially turbulent times in which we now work, which now takes place against a political backdrop that appears increasingly hostile to cosmopolitan learning that I spoke of barely 10 years ago, and some of the other values that we have taken for granted over the past few decades. I want to actually try to understand the nature of these socially turbulent times, which have been widely referred to as populist, associated with the global rise of ethno-nationalist sentiments of various kinds. An enunciation of this populism may be found in a speech that I recommend that many of you should think about reading by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, delivered on 25th of September 2018 at the UN General Assembly. In that speech, which was in many ways reminiscent of his inauguration address, Trump took on the international political order that the United States itself was instrumental in creating after the Second World War. He rejected, in particular, the underlying principles of multilateralism and international cooperation. He portrayed the United States as a major victim of this global order, which he believed had exploited United States and had been exploited by various nefarious external forces. He presented himself as its savior. More fundamentally, he drew a sharp distinction between globalism and cosmopolitanism on the one hand, and patriotism and nationalism on the other. He proposed a world in which each nation, which he assumed possessed its own distinctive and singular set of traditions, values, and culture, should be permitted, he argued, to look after its own national interest. In this way, he articulated a view of nationalism that did not only imply political nationalism, but also ethno-nationalism, based on ethnic distinctiveness of nations, but not only distinctiveness, but also singularity. And it's that focus on singularity that I want to discuss. This is a view that has often been referred to as the kith and kin notion of nationhood. These ethno-nationalist populist sentiments are, of course, not unique to Donald Trump. In recent years, they have been articulated by a growing number of political leaders, from Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, Duterte in Philippines, Marine Le Pen in France, Bolsonaro in Brazil, to Narendra Modi in India. Arguably, these sentiments also underpin the politics of Brexit in the United Kingdom. Around the world, so it seems, ethno-nationalist and anti-globalization sentiments are growing in popularity and appear to have become hegemonic. In Australia, while these sentiments have not quite captured popular imagination to the extent it has in other places. There are many signs that they may, and we need to be alert to those dangers and those risks and think about what could be done. It is in this context that it's important for educators to understand the logic of populism and consider the ways in which it has the potential to undermine the principles of intercultural understanding, internationalization, global cosmopolitanism, and global citizenship education. A key question we need to ask is how might we rethink the nature, the possibilities, and the challenges of these principles, especially those that had been couched in liberal democratic terms, and perhaps prepare students for a world in which ethnic, nationalist, populist ideas cannot simply be wished away. They are here to stay, and they need to be addressed head on. There is, of course, nothing new about the idea of populism. It stretches back to the 19th century. Populist politics has often been deployed in times of rapid technological change, economic decline, cultural uncertainty, and growing social inequalities. Both right-wing and left-wing politicians and political movements have been described as politics. Over the years, it has been a concept that has been widely used to describe political opponents, often in very pejorative terms. Others have viewed the term as being devoid of any significant content and therefore meaningless. Not everyone has, however, viewed it as lacking explanatory potential and normative value. Laclau and Mouffe, for example, consider it not only an essence of politics, but also an emancipatory force. I too take the notion of populism seriously and believe that it describes a cultural and political phenomena that demands closer understanding. In this way, I agree with, where is it? Sorry? Where? Oh, there. I too take the notion of populism seriously and believe it. In this way, I agree with the Princeton political theorist Jean Werner Müller, who argues that populism is neither an authentic part of modern democratic politics, nor a kind of pathology caused by irrational citizens. There is always the possibility, Müller argues, for an actor to speak in the name of the real people as a way of contesting currently powerful elites. That particular idea has a great deal. So it has been, the idea of populism has been around the world with a growing number of such actors emerging over the past decade, with approaches to politics that are quite often different, but nonetheless have much in common. Okay. While each of these populist actors appeal to the people and denounce the elites, their political prescriptions quite often vary, as well as the meaning that they ascribe to the world, the people, and the elites. What is clear is that beyond the general population that focuses on the contentious relationship between the people and the elite, the idea of populism may be an essentially contested concept. It's actually, I think I might ignore that and just simply speak, okay, because I do not have a screen and anyway, that's right. There has, of course, been growing academic literature on populism. Just recently, a very large handbook on populism has been issued, which actually points to the widespread distribution of its power and its influence. Yet, the idea has been theorized in a number of different ways, as a political ideology, as a strategy, as a worldview, as discourse, as style, and as logic. Mudd and Kaltwasser point to a number of theoretical orientation of populism. They describe a popular agency approach which holds populism to mean a democratic way of life through popular engagement in politics. And indeed, Laclau and Mouffe probably fall into that particular category, alongside the critical orientation that they have. The critical approach views populism as deep democracy, not only the essence of politics, but also as an emancipatory force. Socioeconomic approach views it primarily as a type of irresponsible economic policy designed to win popularity in the short term. The strategic approach views it as a political method for governing through unmediated, unassumed support of followers. And folkloric approach views populism as a style of politics to mobilize the masses. So as you can see, populism has been theorized in a number of different ways and people have focused on a number of different aspects. Mudd and Kaltwasser favor what they called an ideational approach, viewing it both as an empirical and judgmental concept that combines facts and values. Basically, it's descriptive as well as prescriptive at the same time, focusing on what they call both its supply and its demand. In other words, the work of political actors, political leaders who actually encourage, and those people who demand such a leader. And you have to look at the complicated dialectical relationship between the people who demand such a leader and the leaders who supply it. Populism, they maintain, is a thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic camps: the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of volent general, the general will of the people. In this sense, there are three concepts that we have to actually focus on. The first is how is the idea of people characterized and is elaborated? How is the idea of elite conceptualized and theorized? And how is the idea of general will of people? In other words, the democracy that is being presented is considered and presented. Now, to my mind, while this definition and this way of thinking about it is useful, it does not explain the global rise of populism around the world. It does not show how its political expressions vary across particular contexts. And it does not reveal how constructions of the people and the elite are mobilized differently and in different ways in different contexts and different locations. In my view, therefore, comparative accounts of populism may help to elucidate its various modalities, as well as its various contradictions and its educational challenges. So what I propose to do now is to examine the two cases of countries where I have lived for considerable periods of time as a child in India for the first 15 years of my life, and then more recently in Illinois for 10 to 11 years, and I continue to be associated with the University of Illinois. So I want to actually look at the ways in which populism has been articulated, and the ways in which populism has been part of the politics of United States and let me actually focus first on the idea of the people. In both India and US, attempts are made to homogenize the idea of the people. In other words, singularize it. It is fundamentally an anti-diversity move that has been made, that actually sees people as being not only belonging to a particular entity, but also having a similar kind of ideological, ethnic, and racial characteristics, producing a sense of ethno-national belonging that is assumed to have both moral and political significance. Of course, we know that much greater diversity exists in both United States and in India, and yet the politics of populism is actually what it's trying to do is actually singularize that idea of belonging. In other words, belonging has become a concept over which there is considerable struggle within the political body to define who the people are and who the we are. Indeed, that's not all that different to what Mrs. Hanson did in 1996. She was trying to describe a we, and the we, the our, is singular and ethno-nationally definitive in her view. And of course, more recently, a review of curriculum by Donnelly and Wilshire did more or less exactly the same thing. They too tried to singularize the idea of the Australian identity and the Australian people. The people is a much more important concept than simply a concept. It is highly contestable and it's highly ideological. It drives people towards patterns of inclusion and exclusion. And as a result, what we find is a way in which the dominant group tries to, if you like, institutionalize its privileges as belonging to the we. In the United States, the construction of the people is increasingly, and probably always has been, associated with the defense of a politics of whiteness. White privilege, a term that we have now become quite familiar, as is precisely what is being tried in view of the diversity, the growing diversity of the country, in view of the civil rights and feminist movements that have been around. There is a major pushback against the idea of white privilege and as a way of showing the people to be largely white. In India, it is linked to the complex histories of colonialism and the politics of caste and religion. So as a result, the current Hindutva agenda is largely based on trying to reject those people who are not Hindu as not quite us, not quite the people, but something else. So as a result, what has happened in India, really interestingly, is when I was brought up there, then British were the colonials. But now anybody who has come from outside is referred to as the colonial. So the Mughals and the Muslims who have come as settlers in that space are referred to as colonial in ways that is considered no different to the ways in which the British were. So as a result, they have expanded the definition of who the other is and who the we are. The we has been narrowed as the other has been expanded. And I think that's actually what's happening in the United States and to a lesser extent in Australia as well. It is the expansion and the contraction around the concept of we that we need to look at. The idea of the common people, indeed, the idea of the silent people or the silent population or minority or other concepts, similar concepts, is often aligned to the most deserving. So the notion of the notion of people is not only designed to describe a particular group of people, but also has a political significance in describing who is the most deserving. Those who are us are much more deserving than those who are outsiders. Outsiders can be tolerated. Outsiders can be allowed to live comfortably, perhaps economically, but they are not one of us, and therefore the privileges that we have should not be allowed to them. So there are those people whose voices are regarded as authentic and preeminent, and those people whose voices are either tolerated or rejected, or towards which number of people are hostile. So what we're looking at is a very complicated notion of people that I think we need to actually look at. Because in schools, we are teaching people who the we are. We are actually trying to actually get our students to understand who the we are. And the dangerous pronoun, as Richard Sennett called it, is an important concept for us to actually give much more thought to than is often done. Let me actually move to the notion of the elite. In the United States, the idea of elites is now mostly associated with the professional class, people like us, the teachers, the doctors, the so on, okay, who, it's argued, have unjustly acquired power. They may or may not have acquired power, but it's simply assumed that they have acquired the power. So anybody who you don't agree with, you can be called elite. And as a result, the notion of elite is criticized, and elites are criticized because it's believed that they have silenced or sidelined or victimized the authentic voices of the people. In India, the notion of elite is not so widely used in political discourse as it is in the United States. But increasingly, the elites are those people who belong to the political opposition. If you like, the nationalist leaders who ruled India for 40, 45 years, the Congress Party, who are now considered elite en masse, while the ruling party is considered us, and ruling party is a Hindu party and is and therefore considered to be authentic. So the politics of authenticity is a really very complicated one here, and needs a lot more attention, and is articulated in ways that are different in different spaces. Those who criticize the ruling party in India are called the anti-national. In other words, they are not one of us because they are outside the ethno-national space. And the creation of ethno-national space is an important geographical as well as cultural and political and moral move that has huge amount of consequences. As a result of this politics, in both India and in US, a notion of undeserving exists. Those who are outsiders and who do not belong or believe in the singular conception of the notion. So the professionals are criticized because they are too much talking about diversity and do not believe in the singularity of the nation, the cohesiveness of the nation. And as a result, are not committed to sense of its destiny as defined by the people, the hegemonic people. The third notion, apart from people is the general will. In both India and US, the notion of general will is used to allude to a particular conception of the political. In other words, the idea of us and them, as in the people, and the elite has now been incorporated around which the politics, the exercise of politics, the nature of politics itself is being defined. In other words, there are major changes taking place in both India and in the United States, and perhaps to a lesser extent in this country, where politics itself is being reconstituted and rearticulated around those two particular key notions. In India, the general will is supported by a majoritarianism. Mr. Modi won 63% of the vote, and as a result, he's sort of saying the country has already decided what India is, and at the last election. And he is repeatedly pointing out that the majority now believes that Indian nation is a Hindu nation, and therefore the privileges are perfectly justified. With popular electoral support, it is able to claim that it's working in the interests of the people, even if the minority voices and interests are suppressed. In the United States, popular support is assumed, but does not often exist. This assumption is really quite an interesting phenomenon to study, because it is argued that the people's will is already understood by those people who are the people. Okay. In other words, the assumption can be made even if the polls show something that is otherwise. Okay. That is, if a poll says that 57% of the people do not agree with you, then there is something wrong with the polls rather than with this is an assumption of majoritarianism or of the people that is assumed in terms of the politics. And that is really quite dangerous. Then if it's not supported by electorally, then imagined is a conspiracy that undermines the will of the people by the corrupt elite. The corrupt elite are those who are creating and who are doing the statistical compilations and the polls, and therefore it must necessarily be wrong. In both cases, in both India and in United States, pluralism and secularism is on the nose, and are ideas that are assumed to be the enemy of the people. In other words, the kind of work that we have done over the last 40, 50 years in favor of secularism and pluralism is under attack, and a sustained attack at that. The next area that I want to look at is relates to the multilateral institution, and different views that people have in those two countries about the value of global institutions. In the United States, the processes of globalization and multilateral institutions are assumed to serve elite interest, leading to what is increasingly being referred to as the democratic deficit and the expansion of social inequalities. In other words, if insofar as the democracy is not working, the people to blame are processes of globalization and multilateral institutions, those who are associated. In other words, social inequality and democratic deficit and democratic issues that are emerging, or the problems with the democracy, are created by these outside institutions. If India and United States were left alone, then they would have a much more perfect democracy. In India, while globalization is assumed to have undermined the integrity of the Indian culture and the people's voice, the critiques of multilateral are often muted. As India benefits greatly from organizations like World Trade Organization and so on, there is not the similar level of critique about multilateral institutions in India as there is in the United States. And yet, globalization is criticized on cultural rather than economic grounds. And as a result, what we are seeing is critiques of globalization are largely cultural rather than economic. In both India and US, the anti-globalization rhetoric is utilized to suggest the damaging effects of the outside forces and to reaffirm the singularity and the purity of the nation. While in US, the outside forces are uniformly viewed with suspicion, in India, the resources of outside actors, such as diaspora, are drawn upon extensively. As a result, what we are seeing is a really quite a very interesting difference between those two countries in relation to the multilateral institution. This difference, of course, has major implications for the future of these institutions, like UNESCO, like UNICEF, like World Trade Organization, and so on, because the popular imagination is being shaped and steered towards hostility for them. And as a result, outside forces are not able to influence local politics to the same extent as they were able to before. Now, the next issue really relates to economic distress and social inequalities. While the US economy has hit hard times in recent years, the Indian economy is still booming with growth rates of around 6 to 7%. However, the Gini coefficient, if you look at that, economic and social inequality have expanded in both countries, resulting from unequal distribution of wealth. Economic distress in both US and India is assumed to be due largely, not to the internal politics and internal policies, but largely outside forces, rather than to any mismanagement, corporate greed, and corruption, and so on. So as a result, what we are seeing is a perfect way in which the community can be told that the cause of your distress and the inequalities and the precarity that you experience is due to international forces and indeed multilateral organization. Now, while in the United States, a golden age of economic strength is romanticized. It's assumed that in 50s and 60s, things were absolutely perfect. In India, global economic dominance is considered entirely probable. In other words, there is a huge romanticization about the future, just as in the United States, there is a huge romanticization about the past. Okay. Neither of them are entirely accurate, but both of them are playing into the politics of populism. In that way, the nation is considered to be unified and supportive of the ruling economic and political agenda. In order to ensure legitimation, which of course is going through a crisis of certain kind, is done by blaming the other while either within the country or outside the country. Now, the other issue that is also important and relevant in both countries relates to religion, patriotism, and ethno-nationalism. In both India and US, religion plays a major role in supporting the claims of ethno-nationalism and patriotism. If you're going to define a clear and singular definition of the people, if you're going to be anti-diversity and anti-pluralism, then some kind of blame is needed, and you can blame forces outside, but something within yourself needs to be found. And this is where religion plays a major role. This is where religion and religious organizations have been brought into the service of ethno-nationalism and patriotism. In India, while secularism and pluralism are still in the constitution, clearly defined and much emphasized, they're increasingly under attack by the Hindu leadership of the nation. Indeed, the critique of the constitution has become really quite extensive in India, especially its clauses relating to secularism and pluralism, which says that you cannot have a unified nation unless you have some commonality around religion, around culture, and around traditions. And as a result, you are arguing that a hierarchy of people who live in the space called India is necessary in order to actually make clear as to who is to be revised as preeminent and who are the people who are outsiders who should be grateful to be allowed to stay in the country. In the United States, despite the higher status that religious leaders have, they're often assigned the label of, they're not assigned the label of elites. So these evangelical leaders are seldom referred to as the elite because they are considered to be the victim. Instead, Christian and religious beliefs are believed to be under attack by the secular elites. Exactly who the secular elites is often presupposed rather than articulated in any clear-cut way. The ideas of pluralism and cosmopolitanism on the one hand and nationalism and patriotism are thus assumed to be incompatible. And yet, that is the agenda that we have fought for over the last 40, 50 years. That is, how do you bring nationalism, citizenship, and globalism, and the notion of global citizenship education is absolutely fundamentally linked to the lack of distinction, the lack of binary between pluralism and cosmopolitanism on the one hand, and nationalism and patriotism on the other. And yet we've got a politics that is emerging that is making that very difficult to sustain. The new media, of course, is playing a major role in this particular politics. The media is, in both India and US, the media is criticized widely for working against the will of the people and in the interest of the elites. And yet, in both countries, it plays a major role in helping the leadership to help the people imagine who they are and what their nation is, as well as what their interests and priorities should be. There is growing evidence relating to the links between contemporary populism and the mediatization of politics, whereby politics is increasingly reshaped and changed as the influence of the media goes, though in ways they are very different in US and India. In India, the media is largely supportive of the ruling party. In United States, it's much more fractured and much more difficult to pin down. and yet media is both an instrument and an enemy and a helper and all those sort of things at the same time. And as a result, media is in a very complicated and ambiguous and deeply, deeply contradictory position in relation to the populism of populist politics. Of course, there is also the idea about the general will and the democracy and discontent. There is growing distrust about representative democracy in both India and US. It is considered incapable of revealing the true and authentic voices. Now, the problem here, of course, is democracy is supposed to come after, in negotiation of authentic voice. But once the authentic voice is assumed, then politics becomes, around democracy, deeply, deeply problematic. It is widely assumed that its practices, democratic practices, are easily exploited and manipulated, preventing the general will of the people to emerge spontaneously and be heard and enacted. In India in particular, dissenting voices are disappearing under the force of populist rhetoric, while in US, aspects of authoritarianism, as you know, are not entirely absent. Now, all of these ideas, these complicated ideas, and these contradictory ideas quite often are being used for political mobilization. In India and US, the processes of political mobilization vary greatly along the various differences in their political system and their political landscape. In India, populism is built on the long historical traditions of Hindu nationalism and social movements like RSS, Shiv Sena, that have given rise to populism. In US, the organized populist social movement are relatively recent but highly dispersed, but nonetheless powerful. In India, personalistic leadership has emerged within these traditions. In other words, Modi has emerged out of the traditions of Hindu nationalism and social movement, whereas in the United States, the support for a particular leader has been coalesced around a range of very conflicting interests. In other words, Indian populism is much more consistent internally than US politics and perhaps even Australian popular politics. But in both places, the role of decisive leadership is quite often assumed. In both India, and there is impatience with slow and sometimes corrupt democratic processes that have led to the idea that, decisive and firm leadership is needed. In both India and and US, the strong leader claims to be personification of the people, always working in their interest, with an assumption that is quite often really very difficult to sustain, but is deeply held, so much so that it's difficult to shake those people who believe in them with any facts and any ideas as such. In other words, the factuality itself has been sidelined in terms of the ontological and metaphysical construction of populism, rather than simply a populism that has grown out of a certain range of facts. So it's not the facts that are driving populism, it is actually the style and the metaphysical assumptions about the ontological reality of us that is driving the populism. Some kind of political organization, it's argued, is necessary to give rise to a populist leader, who can then often re-entrench his position through charisma, through traditional authorities, and reorganization of the state and its various institutions and norms. And this is where I believe the greatest danger lies. Because these modes of thinking that I've described are becoming more and more popular, they're also changing the norms and the institutional practices of both countries. And as a result, while the leaders may change, many of the changed and rearticulated norms may not. And we may actually be stuck with them for a much longer period than them. Of course, finally, I want to say something about education and sort of show how the ideas that I've presented have deep, deep, deep implications for education. Because education is the place where much of the cultural agenda of the last 40 years has been promoted. The extent to which that agenda can be undermined by such forces is something that should worry us all, that should concern us all, and that we should actually look at very carefully. In India, educational institutions are playing a much more extensive and important role in support of the populist politics than they are in the United States. In the US, attempts to overhaul the curriculum and educational governments have largely been unsuccessful. Mrs. DeVos has not been as successful as people had feared. But in India, support for the government's political agenda as exercised through education is assumed, with major changes planned to bring recalcitrant academics and higher education institutions, such as like ourselves, to toe the line. And as a result, the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi has been under constant attack as a social science university, which had promoted some of those ideas of pluralism and of a diverse and multicultural nation. In India, major attempts are being made to rewrite history and social studies curriculum, redefining some basic terms like colonial, for example, as I pointed out earlier. While attempts to do so by Franklin Graham and others have not really quite worked, although in some states they have, states like Oklahoma and Louisiana and Texas to a lesser extent, where most of the textbooks are produced. While attempts to do so in the United States have not worked, they have been widely resisted. This does not mean that further attempts will not be made. So what we are looking at is a very complicated kind of space in which we have all kinds of issues that we need to consider. As an organization, as an institute, as an educational educational community, we need to actually sort of understand a few things. And in my view, I want to put forward 3 ideas, Jill. The first is that sentiments of patriotism and nationalism are unlikely to disappear anytime soon. And they will coexist, they will exist alongside the ideals of global citizenship and cosmopolitans. In other words, we are going to be working in a space that is going to be much more conflict-ridden around this fundamental issue between the binary that I've talked about. And as a result, we need to figure out the ways in which space needs to be created in which we can understand. The second idea is that an empirical understanding of globalization and global interconnectivity and global interdependence and rationalist appeal to pure reason is not sufficient. Okay. Indeed, I think we are at a time, if the logic of the arguments that I presented is anywhere near accurate, then it is quite clear that we are looking at not only the realm of reason, but also the realm of affect. Okay. In other words, we need to actually pay much more attention to the ways in which affects are organized, especially around these issues. An understanding of global interconnectivity is not only empirical, but also necessarily normative, and cannot therefore be expected to be politically uncontested. The complex relationship between ideas of global interconnectivity is therefore complex, contingent, and not abstract. At the same time, in considering this relationship, the politics of emotions and affect cannot be assumed to be irrelevant to normative claims on the grounds that they are empirically unverifiable. Indeed, facts and values come together. Reasons and emotions come together. And we work in a space in which those things are constantly present, and quite often present in a very complicated relationship with each other. In other words, I think it's good to make a distinction between reasons and emotions, but also theorize how they speak to each other, how they have a very complicated relationship with each other. The world is not a community, this is my third point, in any relevant sense, that the cosmopolitan focus on global interconnectivity cannot be expected to generate an ethical attitude towards the world out there. Instead, we are inherently social beings who require a sense of belonging to a tangible political community, grounded community, with which we can identify, unified by a common object of living together. Exactly how we live together across differences, across complexities, and across divergences of various kinds and of contingent and dynamic times is raising a whole range of interesting questions for us as educations. And unless we come to terms with it, and I think we are going to have a difficult time. We live in a time when it is not possible to assume that a unitary, singular, a homogeneous national space is possible, as is assumed by the populist leaders from the right. That's not possible any longer. People are mobile, people are diverse, people are interconnected, people are interdependent. And if that is so, then that is the card that we have to play. But this has to be played against recognition that we are going to be feared for precisely those sentiments. In other words, the sentiments of diversity, pluralism, etc., are precisely the sentiments that are going to raise the questions about the need to find a singularity, the need to find a homogeneity, the need to find rapid developments in technology and social media and our nature of our economy, the globalized economy, is such that intercultural exchange and intercultural encounters are a permanent feature. But the ways in which those encounters are imagined, the ways in which they are theorized, the ways in which that really raises a whole range of interesting questions that I think will occupy us over the next few years with greater urgency and greater importance. Thank you very much. Thank you.